Hey guys, we are doing the Mental Health Awareness Month series, and today I'm bringing on one of my favorite people in the whole wide world. He's a super genius, super creative entrepreneur. His name is Jeff Krasno. He's the founder of Wanderlust Festivals, founder of Wanderlust Hollywood, creator of One Commune, the incredible online course platform with courses from Marianne Williamson, Deepak Chopra, Wim Hof, and tons of other awesome people at the top of their game. And I can't wait to introduce you to him. And here he is right now. He's coming on. Yeah. Thanks, guys, for coming on. Hey, Cynthia. Hey, Deborah, Loretta, Chelsea, Bernadette, Kylie, Jeff Krasno.
Hello, Ben.
What's up? So good to see you.
Nice to be seen.
Dude,
You
you look
look,
fantastic.
thank you. You look very studious with sort of this library background. It enhances your already uh, your huge intellect.
Well, you look very just carefree and light with this beautiful feather behind you and those
Oh, yes.
clean white walls.
Yeah, I've got a double feather
Oh,
technique.
look at that. Wow.
It could be sort of R between two ferns, but between two feathers. How's that? Look, I almost look like a bunny.
Yeah. Oh, yeah, it's perfect. There's like something
Hmm.
very almost like mystical about it.
Yeah, this is a new set for me, so you get the first debut.
All right, guys, you heard it here first. This is the new set. All right, take it in.
We'll see.
Okay, Jeff, you're amazing, first of
Yeah.
all. I have been a huge fan of your work for years, and since you first opened the Wanderlust Hollywood in Hollywood, since you first opened that center, I knew you were a star. I was like, okay, Jeff Krasno's a star. I was like, who's that guy? They were like, oh yeah, he like started this company, and I was like, he's a star. And they were like, he stays pretty much behind the scenes. And I was like, not for long. That dude's a star. And over the last couple of years, you've really stepped into your own brand. You've really shared your own voice and your own opinions more and more. And I'm so glad you're doing it. I think that you're killing it. You have a great eye. You have a great mind. You're so refined and so high level with everything that you do. And your personal opinions, your personal ideas are so refined and clear and insightful that I just think that it's an honor to have you here. You just give such good stuff out into the world. So,
Well, I don't know what to say. I mean, expectation is disappointment in waiting, right? So that's a very kind and generous introduction. Um, and yeah, I'm just over the last couple of years, I've gotten the opportunity to, I guess, stay closer to the work, and and you know, I guess live with greater integrity, and which has come to mean for me to live in alignment with your highest principles, sort of regardless of external circumstances. And God knows I'm far from perfect in that regard, but at least I have a clear definition of what integrity actually means to me. So every day as I am resurrected in the morning, at least I have an index or a metric to look at and say, like, okay, today, one day at a time, I'm going to uh, dedicate my works and actions um, in a way that is in alignment with my highest principles. And so that's helpful, at least to have some form of indices for how you're going to show up in the world. And, I think the more that you do that, the more awareness you have of aligning your works and actions with those principles in the effort to live a spiritual and ethical life, the easier it becomes. You do become acclimated and conditioned to doing that, and it becomes easier to stay close to the work and not give a shit about God, all of the ways I used to identify myself, through the eyes of others or the approval of others or what my job title was or what kind of accolades I had or how many units my book sold or whatever. I honestly just don't care. So, which is very liberating. And I think I learned that from my wife,
Yeah.
Skylar, who's the real superstar. I'm just sort of less humble and
You
just
guys are a
more.
power couple, okay?
I just,
You're
she's,
both superstars.
I've just always I've been willing to be the torchbearer for her because she's the one that's really done the work.
Hmm.
I'm sort of a charlatan, you know. Skylar's the one that did the deep study, um, and has helped so many people, both physiologically and spiritually, kind of with her own strange elixir of teaching.
Yeah.
So,
We all do
yeah.
it in different ways. And I definitely have really personally been blessed by Skylar's work. I love her class. I've never felt like, oh, so good in a yoga class as like when I've worked with Skylar.
Mm-hmm.
But what I really love about what you're doing now is you have a real talent for spotting talent. So there's like a real discernment that you have with your podcast, as well as with your online school, for really bringing in pretty much the best of the best, and people at the top of their game in all these different areas to come in and share their wisdom. What's that process like when you bring them in? Do they usually have an idea of what they want their course content to be, or do you workshop it with them?
It really varies. Some. I'm first of all, I'll get to, how blessed is my life that I've got to spend so much time with the people that have given it meaning, from those who have received many accolades, the Marianne Williamsons and Brendan Burchards and Deepak Chopras, you know, to folks that aren't as well known, but to be honest, have been even more influential. Charles Eisenstein, who has pretty much changed my whole personal philosophy on life. And people might not know who he is, although he wrote an article called The Coronation, which I recently about Corona, which I highly recommend that everybody check out. But it really varies. Someone like Deepak Chopra or Marianne can speak fluently to so many topics. So, part of working with them is more logistical of like, can I get in a room with you? And then, things generally flow. When we've created courses that are more, I suppose, empirical, functional medicine courses with Dr. Mark Hyman, for example. Those kinds of courses that are kind of around functional medicine or take a lot more research, and they're highly scripted. And Mark's incredible. He'll read down an entire course off a teleprompter in one day. So it really depends. And folks like Russell Brand, wrote a book on recovery. Absolutely brilliant, fascinating, highly relatable book around addiction and recovery. And oftentimes it's, getting into somebody's work, whether it's a book or a passion that they have, and then being able to use kind of our best practices to quote unquote productize that into an online video course in a way that makes sense, isn't compelling, and keeps people engaged and stuff. So, the process varies, but like the most gratifying piece of it is that 99% of our courses are shot up here where I am,
Right.
at this property up in Topanga called Commune, which was Neil Young's old ranch and set on 10 acres up at the Santa Monica Mountains, which is
Beautiful property.
absolutely blessed to be here. And we have a production facility on site and a yoga studio and all sorts of cabins, and we hold immersive retreats when people are actually seeing each other in real life. And but what it's afforded us is the ability to, instead of just putting someone up at the Lowe's and giving them their call time, to meet at some nameless, seamless studio, in Hollywood, that folks actually come up here and stay for usually a few days. And
Mm.
so there's obviously the content creation part of the day, which is shooting courses and podcasts. But there's also kind of all of the in-between stuff, which are, hikes and long meandering dinners. And so it creates a level of connection that is fantastic. And honestly, for me, it's been such a blessing because, I get that opportunity to sit there at a table, with people, 10 times my intelligence and essentially just absorb their wisdom in a way that's very different than experiencing them at a conference or something.
Totally. Yeah. I mean, you're definitely in a really, really rare position in that way, and I think that what's really wonderful about that is that you sort of leverage that intimacy that you get to experience. And that's what comes across in the content that your company produces, that one company produces in the courses. There's a lot of different programs, a lot of different online course platforms, and a lot of people probably who are watching this now or later are people who create their own online course platforms. We're people helpers. We want to contribute. We're teachers and counselors and coaches and therapists and things like that. And I think that you've done something very unique in bringing the production quality so high that it's impossible for the rest of us to compete with it.
Wow. Yeah, I mean, I've always been a hand wringer around look and feel. That started at Wanderlust, where, the general, I guess, production value or design value was not particularly refined kind of in the yoga sphere, 10 or 15 years ago, overly littered with Sanskrit and Ganesha and, whatnot, which of course I've come to even greater appreciate now than I did then. But I think, in order to make it more relatable, when I started Wanderlust anyways, it was about kind of cleaning that up a little bit and presenting it with, design and kind of deliverability functionality that was more refined and, in order to give people an experience that was refined and was, more like watching a, feature documentary on Netflix. And so, as I kind of surveyed the landscape in the digital course world, there's a lot of tremendous thought leaders and a lot of tremendous content and information, but oftentimes it wasn't captured with any kind of regard for production. And
Right.
so, if I can help to kind of bring up that game a little bit, but there's some inherent drawbacks to that. Like I never want to sacrifice the information for the sun being at the perfect angle, to capture the shot or whatever. But I think there's a way to do both, and sort of just bring that world along a little bit.
Yeah.
And I suppose
And you really have,
modernization.
you really have. I think Wanderlust as a brand was uh, one of the most influential brands in sort of the mainstreamification of yoga. The different partnerships that Wanderlust developed, like Adidas, of course,
Mm-hmm.
and all of the offshoot festivals that took place. The pairing running with yoga, things like that. I think
Yeah,
definitely.
to be honest, I have a lot of misgivings about that looking
Yeah.
back. I think there's a balance between making a bigger tent for these modalities that I think are absolutely important to addressing some of the world's most salient problems, yoga and meditation and other forms of modalities that I think, address intrinsic issues of well-being, both personal and societal. But I think there's a risk around the demystification of something like meditation, for example, where in the name of spreading it to more people, we're packaging it up and marketing it as like optimal performance or focus at work, or, that it becomes this just another thing to sort of feed the beast of, capitalist consumption.
Hmm.
And that, of course, is antithetical to why it was created
Right.
in the first place.
Right.
So I think in some ways, like where I'm kind of personally at right now is like I'm a little bit more interested in remystifying yoga and meditation
Right.
to kind of bring it back to the mystical,
Hmm.
um, and reconnect it with notions of the transcendence of self versus like get ahead at work, or
Right. I think that
perform
I think
perform
it's
on the
both
football
important.
field, or
Yeah, I think
the
it's
Marines, or whatever.
right, right. I think it is both very important, because it's like the mind. We have a collective mind, and the mind does have to process through things. And so if we look at the way we have to be exposed to things as individuals, we have to process through things. I sent you an early copy of my book, which a lot of people are surprised. No one's more surprised than me that I wrote a Christian book.
Mhm.
And so for the record,
I have it
but
right here.
oh yeah, well let's see
Yeah.
it. Let's see it, Jeff.
I have to get up and
I'm just
I'll do it. Hold on.
okay. Okay, cool. All right. Oh, there it is. He really does have it. You
There we go.
really did have it right
I
there.
did. I
Okay, cool.
wasn't just. I can't stand lip service
Ah,
or small talk. So I decided to eschew both of them and promote your book right here. And
uh,
I'll be honest with you, I haven't read it all, but I have read some of it, and I find it really interesting and fascinating. I love the notion of like bringing meditation, um, to a new community,
mm-hmm,
obviously, to a community that already understands and connects with prayer
mm-hmm,
and connects with a notion of spirituality,
mm-hmm.
albeit a very, very different notion.
Right. Well,
Um,
and see, I
yeah.
think that's the area right there that I wanted to work with. Is that I came, Marianne Williamson. I remember in the course that she did for your company for One Commune, you guys invited me to be a part of that. And one of the things that we talked about in that course was the notion of reconciliation with your childhood religion,
Hmm.
and the psychological benefits thereof. And I remember that conversation for me continued with Marianne after that, and it largely inspired the creation of this book, which actually comes out today. Today is the release.
Oh, great. Awesome.
Yeah, today's the release day.
Congratulations.
So thanks for plugging it. But yeah,
My pleasure.
the idea really was that when you look at it, it's actually not that different. It actually really is already not that different. Its expression is quite different. The way culture has taken tradition, and culture and tradition and beliefs have been so enmeshed generationally that we experience it so differently. But a real deep study of it actually delivers a very similar transmission as the Bhagavad Gita. It's actually not unlike the Bhagavad Gita. And look, a lot of Christians don't like my relationship to it, so I don't want to like act like all Christians are on board with what's in this book,
Mhm.
But the idea really was to, yes, bring it to another community, in a way that is compatible with traditional thought within that community, but also, like you said, remystifying something. I want to remystify Christianity. There's Jesus was ultra mystical, very, very mystical, and Jesus was not this prejudiced, limited thinking, closed-minded, legalistic person. He was such a renegade. I like to say Jesus was the original New Ager. He refuted the hypocrisy of his day. He fulfilled the old covenant. He created a new covenant. He created a new commandment, which was love God, love others. You know, so I think it's really returning to its mystical origin, kind of like what you're saying you want to do with yoga and meditation in your work.
Yeah. I mean, and it's always helpful to remember that Jesus was largely a healer. Um, and we look at the modalities that we are very close to and espouse, and they're often very much about healing. But that's, if you actually break down, what did he spend most of his time doing? Healing.
Right.
Now, it's probably good that science wrested medicine from the spiritualists in the long term, but still, I think that depending on your cultural or religious context, any individual may feel a sense of epiphany, whether that's Christ consciousness or oneness within a Christian tradition, or kind of the transcendence of self in a Buddhist tradition, or Advaita Vedanta, or Moksha Kaivalya in Hindu tradition, that that depending on your own cultural context, you may associate feelings of self-transcendence with your particular religion. And I
Right.
think that that is absolutely wonderful and fine. I
Mm-hmm.
think where I have a difficult time with the Abrahamic religions is that they are dualistic in nature,
Mm-hmm.
where, you know, theism that grew out of the agricultural movement and then later gave birth to a lot of the Abrahamic religions
Mm-hmm.
were about taking God or the divine that we used to be very connected to, that used to exist in nature, where we used to essentially walk amongst the divine, satyrs and other forms of gods that were right here on earth, that were in many ways responsible for the rain and the harvest and all these other kinds of things.
Mm-hmm.
And, Abrahamic religions took the notion of God and the divine and separated it from nature, separated it from humanity, and put it up in the sky.
Mm-hmm.
And in a way, cleaved the relationship between the physical material world in which we live and the world of the divine. And
Mm-hmm.
that led to the last, you know, millennia of what I call, or what Charles Eisenstein would call, the story of separation.
Mm-hmm.
That essentially we feel that we are unique individuals, distinct from other individuals, living in an external universe, separate from God, separate from nature, separate from each other.
Mm-hmm.
And that concerns me. That Christian tradition concerns me, um, because it makes us feel like that our soul is not something that is here of this earth, and it cleaves a sense of oneness. And so, if you
Well,
look at like the
I
yeah.
see what you mean, because that's largely the way the generational cultural interpretation of those things has demonstrated. But I don't actually see, like, when you really study the work of Abraham, it was very much a relationship with the divine. Um, and it was actually very interconnected. And, and he saw the divine even in the stars. They say Abraham was actually the one who created astrology, and so he was actually himself very connected to nature. And I think that part of what has happened is that through language we've struggled to describe the miraculous and the phenomenological supernatural aspects of nature. And I think that those ancient prophets, in their attempt to describe it, um, created these allegories and used myth liberally,
Mhm.
and used words. And I think that what happened was those who were taught, they couldn't always understand it. And what you see is in all of the ancient traditions, not just in the Abrahamic traditions, um, there is a notion of some aspect of polarity, the yin and the yang, for example. There is an aspect of like the interplay of the Shiva and Shakti.
Mhm.
And really, when you look at like Christian cosmology, and you start to go a little bit more esoteric with it, there's the esoteric and exoteric of all traditions. And the esoteric is really for people who are like focused, who are going to learn the more advanced stuff, line upon line, precept upon precept. You don't get to like the third, fourth, fifth degrees until after you pass level 1. And the general public doesn't even really get through level 1. So the general public barely learns to count, whereas the mathematicians learn to do really advanced calculus, you know. And so the general public of Christian cosmology sees the devil, sees hell as and heaven and God as these like beings and places that you experience after you die. But in more esoteric Christian cosmology, like in the tradition I was raised in, I was raised very much in esoteric cosmology, a long lineage of it. I joined the priesthood when I was 12. I became a priest when I was 16. I did 4 years of seminary. My mother was a teacher in seminary. My father's a direct descendant of the founder of my family's tradition. So very, very much in the esoteric traditions of it. And what I was taught was that Jesus and Lucifer were brothers, and that hell is the refiner's fire of true remorse and repentance. And so in our lives, we experience, and even after we die, we have the ability to repent and refine and heal after we die. That's the belief. But that there's no damnation. And in the way I was actually taught, hell was just this state of experience because of our of the pain that we create, basically because of negative karma. And so for me, I actually was raised in a real unity consciousness type of Christianity, where even Satan himself would one day be purified and refined and return to the Father, return to heaven. So it is really interesting because we're in this massive collective awakening of consciousness, and that's why I wrote this book. As you can see in this book, the purpose and the content of that book is my exoteric teaching. It's not my highest level esoteric teaching. It's my exoteric transmission to invite in the level 1 initiates to that which I have to offer. You know what I mean? And there's other levels that go beyond level 1. You know, but so that's something that I've always really noticed, is that notion there is a yin and the yang, there is a light and a dark. And what we need with Christianity is a metaphysical reinterpretation of the original teachings.
Yeah. I mean, I struggle with this right now because I certainly, there's a kind of optimistic side of me that wants to embrace the notion that we have a soul, and that soul is love, and that we experience that through empathy and compassion and gratitude and forgiveness, and all of these perennial precepts that have been echoed by virtually every poet and mystic and sage over time immemorial. The problem is that there's no proof of that. Science has really tried, and that the rational conceptual mind can only understand so much, and it only has 5 very, very limited instruments to perceive phenomena in the world to give it its information. So what the fuck do I know? Very, very little. But on the surface, if I think of like Buddhism, which was essentially a story about a dude walking through Nepal trying to understand the mystery of his own mind, versus a set of mythologies around a wizened old man that is the source of creation of all of the universe, one feels more incredulous to me than the other.
Right.
And so I'm trying to square like my desire for there to be something greater, to be something for there to be a mystical force in the world that I do not understand, that is not empirically available to mankind.
Mm-hmm.
You know, and certainly, like, there's very little to explain the nature of consciousness, whether or not it's just a fortuitous springing forth of a combination of atoms that expresses itself in a human being and then, you know,
Mm-hmm.
ceases and terminates upon physical death. I don't know.
Mm-hmm.
We don't really know. Or, you know, does it stand behind all things?
Right.
You know? Um, and so,
Or does it fill and permeate all things, like in the notion of chi, prana, those kinds of things where we breathe, like you and I take a deep breath right now. you know, there's one life, and from a Buddhist perspective, there's one life and infinite points of view. So as we breathe, you and I, we draw upon the one source of life, and it temporarily animates this mechanism and that mechanism, and we have this temporary experience of relationship with one another. I think that's an interesting thing about, you mentioned the Abrahamic traditions. Comparing the Eastern and Western traditions, the Abrahamic traditions usually referred to as the Western traditions, comparing them, they all have this notion of unity. And based on that premise where it's like, hey, look, they're trying to explain really complex things, and they had a more poetic, less utilitarian language. We know that about Sanskrit, we know that about Latin. It's more poetic, it's less utilitarian than English. So there's pros and cons to both of that. But with English, we can be a little bit more precise about the multifaceted nature of all these different things,
Yeah.
And so when we look at, for example, in the Judeo-Christian Islamic traditions, we see the notion that I'm your brother, that we're brothers, that we're all brothers and sisters in the family of God, And then in the Eastern traditions, we hear a slightly more literal thing where there's only one of us here. But what's interesting there is the notion of reincarnation. Mm-hmm. So reincarnation, the exoteric teaching of reincarnation is that Jeff Krasno is an ego identity that was born and will incarnate and reincarnate. And that's a very popular thing. The ego really likes to talk about our past lives and to be like, oh, you know how many people were Cleopatra in a past life? A lot.
I know, my grandmother for sure. Yeah.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
Like a lot of,
a lot of people. Yeah.
The inner teachings, the higher level metaphysical esoteric teachings of reincarnation say that reincarnation itself was never intended to be a literal doctrine, that reincarnation itself was a metaphorical doctrine in order to help us conceptualize unity consciousness, where Jeff Krasno and Ben Decker are parallel lives, one life, separate points of view. So that we could start to basically deepen our connection to one another and recognize that holographic, multidimensional component of reality. Same with the idea that you're my brother. We're literally not brothers, obviously, but if we think of each other as brothers, it'll deepen our understanding of our connection to one another.
Yes, and I think on some level, these are all what one might call true world theories. That that it is in our nature to look for purpose and meaning in our lives, and that there are different historical and cultural circumstances that give birth to a variety of like stories and mythologies, all of which could be true and none of which could be true, but that they all serve the goal of us trying to understand what the hell we're doing here. Yeah. And I think that some, I would say have more of an empirical playbook, as you've outlined, than others. I mean, certainly, like for me, Buddhism is a more clear, like playbook. Like you do this, you do these things, and here's the result. Mm-hmm. You're suffering because your mind, you're lost in thought. You're continually distracted. You have cravings and desires.
Right.
Here is a method. Here's a methodology to eschew those cravings and desires through cultivating
equanimity,
unattachment, and becoming aware of your own awareness. Right. And that is, to me, where I currently sit, obviously you could ask me my biography and I have a certain personhood that I'm happy to bore you with at some other time. But if you were asking me to really, on a spiritual level, describe who I am, that I am the experiencer of transitory phenomena happening moment to moment. That is it.
Mm-hmm.
And that if you can live with the awareness of that awareness, you can live a fairly contented life. And so much of our suffering, and obviously the pretext for this conversation is mental disorder, mental illness. I mean, so much of our suffering is phantoms of our own projection.
Mm-hmm.
Really, the story that we tell ourselves about ourselves through the conceptual mind,
Mm-hmm.
that can be addressed through the cultivation of awareness of our consciousness, awareness of a non-judgmental state of being that recognizes that all we are is perceiving different phenomena in this very, very moment, in this very single moment.
So
Yeah.
the way I see that is, we look at humanity's evolution of consciousness, and Buddhism took place. The Buddha's Siddhartha Gautama's life happened substantially after the creation of the Vedic traditions. So he was raised in the Vedic tradition, and so he had the foundation of the Vedic tradition. Many years later, Jesus came along. He was raised in an esoteric Jewish tradition, not traditional Judaism. He was raised as an Essene, which is a very mystical vein of Judaism. And so the Buddha, when it comes to human consciousness, the Buddha created this field of collective possibility for Christ to do something different. So the reason I say that Christ is the original New Ager is because he in many ways integrated the fundamental principles of Buddhism into the fundamental principles of Judaism into a completely new thing.
Yeah.
And
Well, and everyone feels like they've got the last word on God, and then,
well, the good
Gabriel
news,
comes down 600 years later to Muhammad and gives him the next last word. It's like, yeah.
I think the biggest mistake we could say is that it's the last word. And
Yes.
I think that a truer thing that we can say is it is line upon line, precept upon precept. It's an ongoing evolution of consciousness. And that is one thing that Christ did teach. One thing that he taught, one of the core things that he taught was this is not over. One of the core things he taught was this is just beginning.
Mm-hmm.
And he said, if you get what I'm doing, you're going to be able to do greater things than I can do. If you get what I've got, you can do more,
That's right.
And
yeah, I think, certainly we have often confused the teachings of Jesus with institutional Christianity.
correct.
And these are kind of two very different things. And I would agree with you that even the most meek among you will accomplish everything I have and more, or whatever. I'm not good.
Well,
I'm not good at scripture, but
yeah,
but that there are there are teachings that we can follow that are essentially like different mask, same face.
right.
And whether you're reading Emerson or Melville or Meister Eckhart or Jesus or Siddhartha or Lao Tzu, certainly. I mean, there's a book called Jesus or Lao Tzu that actually, I don't know if you've seen that book, but they on the same pages they say everything that Lao Tzu wrote and everything that Jesus said, and they compare them, and it's remarkable.
Right.
And so, of course, ideas can get co-opted and, used for certain purposes of
Right.
power and whatever. That's an old story. As I was writing this little piece today about the separation of the material from the spiritual. And I interviewed India Arie earlier, or maybe last week, and we were talking about actually sacred space. It was talking about her altar space where she does a lot of her creative songwriting, etc. And I was like, well, what does that look like? And she, went and described all of these incredible, photos and these old frames of her great great grandmother, and like, mala beads that she bought in Rishikesh on a particular thing, and like objects that actually have real divinity and sacredness in them. And I was like, well, that's beautiful. We often think of the objects in our life being devoid of spirituality or the divine, plastic water bottles, straws, restaurant cutlery. I mean, we essentially treat the physical material world as if it is disposable. And it's no wonder that we have, a climate crisis, because we just essentially think that we can just throw everything away because nothing has any real spiritual value.
Mm-hmm.
And this is one of my beefs with Christianity, is that that out of the agricultural kind of revolution, Christianity emerged to give man dominion over nature and animals. And essentially, I mean, there were the animists before that essentially thought of ourselves as part of nature and part of and as an animal. And now we're thinking about us being very, very separate from nature, and to the point that we have dominion over it. And that's, I think, one of the modern stories that has led to a lot of problems, a lot of feeling of separation.
I think it's again an interpretation problem. I think really tuning into what dominion really means. Dominion and domicile have the same root word. So home, when you have dominion over something, you're the leader of that home. And I think it's very clear that humanity has like a different kind of skill set that does make it unique, whatever that might be. And the way that a mystical or metaphysical reinterpretation of those texts, of those words, I don't think the original author, I've read some reviews of my own works, and I'm like, you don't know what the fuck you're talking about, because that's not what I meant,
Yeah.
And so, like, I don't think the original author of those words meant what all these other people are saying, because it's not that the prophetic founder of Buddhism. By the way, a lot of what institutionalized Buddhism does today is highly contradictory to what the Buddha actually taught, and it has a different cultural expression than Christianity, because I think largely because the colonialists wore the cross, and it was sort of in this context of like European royalties' relationship to Catholicism and the Church of England and that kind of thing. But I think that's really the root of what I call dysfunctional Christianity. But what I see dominion as, it's a little more Snow White. Snow White, like, understood the animals. She paid attention to what they needed. She had a relationship with them. It's almost like in Lord of the Rings, where the elf kingdom, if there's a problem, the rabbits come to the elves and they're like, yo, dude, check it out. We got a problem. And I see that as what the original author of that notion of having dominion over the animals in the Old Testament. I think that's truer to the origin of what it really means. Because if you read it, I took a course in Aramaic. We were studying Aramaic, Hebrew, Greek, and Latin, and specifically in the context of the Bible. And if you're really looking at that and you don't have an existing preconceived notion of what you want Christianity to be, which I think most Christians do, we're raised to believe certain things. We want it to be how we are. We're the chosen ones. You guys, you know what I mean? That kind of notion, that separation consciousness that you're referring to. I didn't have that. I went into that to have my own direct relationship with it. And I was like, wait a second. This is basically pagan. This
Yeah.
is basically a different culture's expression of actually a very beautiful nature centric pagan tradition that actually insisted that humanity have a higher calling and higher relationship with animals and nature. And so I call myself Christian. A lot of Christians don't think I'm Christian, partially because of this exact conversation, where I think that humanity's dominion over nature is that we're the stewards of nature. I think being a dominion over nature means like this is our home, this is our domicile, this is our home, and we need to take care of it. We need to, as a father, your father, you have responsibility over your family members. You're there if they need something. There's a responsibility you have to the home and to the other needs that they have. And I see humanity's role in relationship with nature in that way, you know.
Hmm.
And you're bringing up the exact things that I had a problem with, that I needed reconciliation with, which is,
Yeah.
I think, why I was like, you know what, I'm going to take this head on. Let's do it. I'm writing a book about Christ. Let's do it.
Yeah, I think it's a very brave thing to do because it's a very obviously loaded subject and certainly not something that's particularly, I suppose, popular in a particular sect of society. So,
Right.
and there's so much to unpack, and there's so much to learn. I think that as and my opinions continue to evolve around it. As I start to try to learn a little bit more about history and actually spend some time, reading instead of just running businesses. Um, you know, I look at the ideas that are birthed out of certain historical and cultural circumstances, and then how those ideas become sort of the mythologies that create the imagined orders of that particular time, and whether or not, okay, we figured out how to create 10,000 10,000 BC, we figured out how to start to create surplus in agriculture, how to domesticate animals, etc. Did we at that juncture need a spiritual excuse to be able to do that, and then created mythologies around theism and then subsequently Christianity in order to essentially justify our dominion over animals, nature, etc. I mean, right now I'm like having a lot of moral issues because like there is more and more evidence to
Mhm.
speak to the notion that many animals, mammals, are sentient, that they
Of
essentially
course.
experience, that they are conscious, that they do experience a range of emotions, yet we separate them from their children at a very young age. We
Right.
put them in pens where they can't even move. And I'm not like on the front lines of veganism at
Hmm.
all, but to be honest, I, it's you know I'm not sure I can morally justify the treatment of other um, conscious beings the way that we're currently um, you know, doing in
Hmm.
modern society. So, anyways, these are just, this is
Dude,
part
we
of
could
my
talk
own
for
personal
hours. I
evolution.
feel like we could just sit here and talk for hours. I really love the way you think, and a lot of the things that you're bringing up, like really, really call to mind things that have bothered me, that have guided and directed a lot of the study and direction of my personal work.
Hmm.
Um, the the things that you're saying now about animals and everything like that. That's a huge issue. It's a
Yeah.
huge thing. Animal slavery. Um, it's huge, and I think that you're right. I think in the future, and I think to speak to, like, you were talking about agriculture, agricultural surplus, and the creation of spirituality and religion after that. Um, we could talk for hours about it. We only have a few more minutes left before Instagram shuts us up. But the thought that I have on that is some of these things were to describe that which was already taking place, to give us a little bit of a context and narrative. Like so many people are saying right now that we need that we needed coronavirus. There's like coronavirus doctrine. We needed it for this. It happened for this. This is the real story. There's this whole coronavirus doctrine taking place. And I think that it's because of a collective experience. And I think it's normal. We all needed that. And I think that's the new world religion is actually not a new religion. It's actually a metaphysical reinterpretation of all the old traditions re-expressed.
Yeah. Well, yeah. I may argue that I'd take a Nietzschean position on this and say God is dead, and not for everyone, and I certainly hope not for everyone. But as I examine the conditions of humanity, it strikes me that capitalism is our religion, and unlike other religions, we actually adhere to its precepts.
I would invite you to be open to the notion that some of those ideas that you're articulating are based on separation consciousness, and that separation itself is the illusion. And so I think that capitalism has a place in all of it, and I believe God's alive, and I believe that there is no life beyond God. In Kabbalah, there's a notion there is none else beside him. There's nothing that exists besides God. Only God exists. And so the notion of the veil, the temporary experience of our separation for the purpose of our experience, I would say that you were talking about the Nietzschean perspective. You also talked about like Abrahamic, all those things, compartmentalizing and separating them. That's not what the ideas that birthed those wanted. They're contributing to the collective. So I would say, open your mind to the idea that everyone's right. How are they right? In what ways are they right? Rather than a compare and contrast, more of like a co-create and collaborate notion.
Yeah. I think, though, that for me, it's important to delineate between spiritual notions of God and the soul versus consciousness. And they often get conflated into one thing. That it's a very different thing to pray and meditate and find self-transcendence, to essentially lose notion of the illusory self, that all there is the world, that there are no eyes behind experience or behind the concept of Brahman, that there is just one large mind of which we are all refractions of. I think that for me is a very different proposition than saying we all have a soul that will be judged inevitably by something that is outside of us. And
well, I think it all comes down to the reinterpretation, because
I agree. Yeah.
I see the soul being judged, it's almost like a filter. It's like when have you recently done something stupid that you regretted?
Yeah, probably on this Instagram.
Well, think about it. It's like, we make these certain mistakes, we do certain things, and then we come back to reality and we say, I shouldn't have done that, And so I see the judgment as an extraordinary metaphysical truth that we do not understand accurately. I think that there's when I was in college, I was in comparative religion, but I never called it that because I didn't feel like that was helpful. I called it collaborative religion. And so I think that there's more that we can talk about, because I think that it's an interesting, it's almost like different ideas in the mind about processing together and integrating these different notions. Thanks,
Yeah.
Frank. Hi, Frank.
I know that we have just a couple minutes left, um, and I know you're leading this series on mental health, and which I think is an incredibly great thing that you're doing, and just excited to be part of it. I do attribute a lot of mental illness. Now, there are many causes for mental illness, and we know how prevalent it is in our society. I mean, I was reading some numbers. It's like 50 million Americans suffering from some form of mental illness, whether that be very, very acute from schizophrenia and bipolar, which is a smaller number of people, but very, very acute, to general anxiety and depression. And that the causality is often very linked to trauma or neglect, or that there's a lot of that that the causes of depression and mental illness can be often traced to trauma.
Right.
I do think that there is another more insidious culprit that is contributing to global anxiety, and that is rooted in what I refer to as our modern religion, in capitalism, and the feelings of inadequacy that people have, which lead them to self-harm, addictive behaviors, overeating, etc., which contributes now to, for the first time in generations and generations, a falling life expectancy in the biggest swath cohort of society, kind of those between kind of the 30th and 90th percentile of income. And I think it's very prevalent, expressed in every single facet of society, where you cannot swivel your head without seeing projections of images and messages that make us feel like we're not enough.
Right.
And then products.
We have about 60 seconds left.
Yeah.
Before it shuts down automatically.
Yeah. Anyways, I would love to get into that at some point with you, because it is something that I'm very fixated on it.
They're asking for a part 2. I would love to do this with you again. You have a great mind. I love talking with you about this. I definitely recommend everyone go follow Jeff Krasno, follow One Commune. Great courses, even in spite of the economic context and our modern religion of capitalism and all of the despair that it does incite, as Jeff's mentioning. You can take great courses, and so many, they're free. They're free to try when they're launched. So thank you so much for that contribution. Thank you for a really interesting conversation, Jeff.
Yeah. God bless, man. I love you.
Yeah, bless you too. Let's talk to you soon.
Okay.
Bye-bye. Thanks, guys. Bye.